The training hall was in ruins again. Carveth stood in the center of the destruction, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. His claws were still out, still dripping with the blood of his instructor. Around him lay broken training dummies, shattered weapons, and deep gouges in the stone floor. The walls bore the marks of his fury, long scratches that told the story of a rage that could not be stopped. He was only 12 cycles old, just a cub by Zorath standards. But he had the strength of a full-grown warrior and the temper of a wild beast. The Zorath were the apex predators of the Helix cluster. They stood 7 feet tall on average, covered in dark scales that could stop a blade. Their fangs could crush bone, and their claws could tear through metal. For thousands of years, they had been the most feared hunters in the galaxy. Their society was built on discipline, control, and the cold precision of the hunt. But Carveth had none of that control. His father, War Chief Drogar, stood at the entrance of the ruined hall. He was massive even by Zorath standards, his scales scarred from 100 battles. He looked at his son with eyes that held equal parts anger and despair. "Again," Drogar said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is the 3rd instructor this month." Carveth did not answer. He could not explain what happened inside him. The rage came like a storm, sudden, violent, and impossible to stop. One moment he was sparring normally, and the next moment everything went red. The sounds became too loud. The lights became too bright. Every sensation crashed into him like a wave, and the only way to make it stop was to destroy everything around him. "I did not mean to," Carveth finally said. His voice was rough, still shaking with leftover anger. "You never mean to." Drogar walked closer, his heavy footsteps echoing in the destroyed space. "But meaning does not matter. Results matter, and your results are chaos, blood, and shame." Carveth looked down at his claws. The blood was drying now, turning dark against his scales. He hated himself in these moments. He hated the thing inside him that he could not control. The healers had examined him many times. They said his neural pathways were different from other Zorath. He experienced emotions at a magnitude that would overwhelm most beings. Every sound fed into his brain at full volume. Every light was too bright. Every touch was too intense. His senses, which should have made him a perfect hunter, instead made the world an assault on his mind. The elders had tried everything. They put him in meditation chambers where he was supposed to find inner peace. He destroyed the chambers. They sent him through combat conditioning meant to teach control through exhaustion. He hurt his trainers. They even tried the ancient rites of the blood calm, a ceremony that had not been performed in generations. It did nothing. Now the elders whispered about exile, or worse. Drogar stopped in front of his son and looked down at him. "The Galactic Coalition is sending a human to our world," he said. "A cultural liaison. Part of some new peace initiative." Carveth looked up. "A human? Why should I care about a human?" "You should not. They are soft and weak. They break easily." Drogar's lip curled in disgust. "But the Coalition insists on this exchange of representatives. We must host this human and pretend to be interested in their culture. What does this have to do with me? Nothing. I tell you only so you know to stay away from her. The last thing we need is for you to lose control around a human and cause a diplomatic incident." Drogar turned to leave, then paused. "Clean up this mess and report to the healers." Again, Carveth watched his father go. He felt the familiar shame settling into his bones. He was supposed to be the son of a war chief. He was supposed to be strong and controlled and worthy of his bloodline. Instead, he was broken. A failure. A beast that could not be tamed. The human arrived 3 days later. Her name was Grace Holloway, and she was nothing like Carveth expected. The Zorath had seen humans before, of course. They were small, fragile creatures without claws or fangs or scales. Easy prey, if the Zorath had been interested in hunting them. But humans had proven themselves useful in other ways: their technology, their diplomacy, their strange ability to make friends with almost every species in the galaxy. Grace was tall for a human, though still much shorter than any Zorath adult. She had brown skin and dark hair that she kept tied back. Her eyes were kind, and she smiled too much. The Zorath found it unsettling. She arrived with a single bag and immediately began asking questions. She wanted to know about Zorath history, Zorath art, Zorath family structures. Most of the Zorath ignored her or gave short, dismissive answers. But Grace did not seem bothered by this. She just kept smiling and kept asking. Carveth watched her from a distance during her first few days on the planet. He was curious despite himself. He had never met a human before. They were so strange, so obviously weak, yet they moved through the Zorath compound without fear. Grace, in particular, seemed completely unconcerned that she was surrounded by predators who could kill her with a single swipe of their claws. It annoyed him. On the 5th day, there was a diplomatic dinner. Carveth was required to attend because of his father's position. He sat at the far end of the table, as far from the human as possible, and tried to ignore the sounds and smells that pressed in on him from all sides. But then Grace approached him. "You must be Carveth," she said, sitting down across from him without asking permission. "I have heard about you." Carveth felt his muscles tense. "What have you heard?" "That you are troubled. That you have a fire inside you that you cannot control." The rage sparked in his chest. Who was this human to speak to him about his problems? Who was she to look at him with those calm, knowing eyes? "You know nothing about me," he growled. "That is true," Grace agreed. "But I would like to learn." Something about her tone made the rage burn hotter. She was not afraid of him. She should be afraid of him. Everyone was afraid of him. Carveth stood so quickly that his chair flew backward. He grabbed the edge of the heavy stone table and flipped it over, sending food and dishes crashing to the floor. Zorath warriors jumped to their feet, hands going to their weapons. But Grace just sat there, now chairless and tableless, looking up at him with that same calm expression. Carveth snarled at her, then turned and stormed out of the hall. Behind him, he heard his father apologizing to the human. The shame burned almost as hot as the rage, but Grace was not offended. She simply watched the young cub go, and she began to think. Grace did not give up easily. In the days after the dinner incident, she began asking questions about Carveth. She spoke with the healers, the trainers, and anyone who would talk to her. Most Zorath were reluctant to discuss the war chief's troubled son, but Grace was patient. She listened more than she spoke, and slowly, the story came together. She learned that Carveth had been different from birth. Even as an infant, he had screamed for hours at sounds that did not bother other cubs. As he grew, his reactions became more violent. He could not tolerate crowds or loud noises or bright lights. The world itself seemed to be his enemy. The Zorath healers had a name for his condition, but they did not have a cure. They believed his neural pathways were wired wrong, that his brain could not filter out the constant flood of sensory information. Everything hit him at full force, all the time. It was like living inside a storm that never ended. Grace understood something the Zorath did not. She recognized what Carveth was experiencing because humans had dealt with similar conditions for thousands of years. Sensory overload, emotional dysregulation, the feeling that the world was simply too much. Humans had learned to cope with these things. They had developed tools and techniques over centuries. And Grace had an idea. She found Carveth one evening in a ruined courtyard at the edge of the compound. It was a place that had been destroyed long ago and never rebuilt a safe space, where Carveth could be alone with his fury without hurting anyone. He was on his knees when she arrived, his claws dug deep into the cracked stone floor. His breathing was ragged, and his muscles trembled with the effort of holding himself still. He was trying to claw the rage out of himself, but it was not working. It never worked. Grace approached slowly and sat down on a fallen pillar about 10 feet away. Close enough to be present, far enough to be safe. She did not speak at first. She just sat there, quiet and calm, waiting. Carveth knew she was there. He could smell her, that strange human scent of soap and sweat, and something he could not name. He wanted to tell her to leave. He wanted to roar at her until she ran away like any sensible creature would. But he was so tired. "You hear everything, don't you?" Grace finally said. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Everything at once. And you cannot make it stop. Everything. Carveth's claws stopped moving. He stayed very still, his head bowed toward the ground. Every sound is a scream, Grace continued. Every light is a blade in your eyes. Every touch feels like an attack. The world is too loud, too bright, too much. And no one understands. They just see the rage. They do not see the pain behind it. Slowly, Carveth raised his head and looked at her. His amber eyes were wide, almost vulnerable. How do you know this? Because humans have struggled with these things too, Grace said. We have had many people throughout our history who experienced the world too intensely. For a long time, we did not understand them. We thought they were broken, or possessed, or cursed, but eventually, we learned that their brains simply worked differently, and we learned that there were ways to help. Carveth stared at her. No one had ever described his experience so accurately. No one had ever made him feel like something other than a monster. Help? He repeated. The word sounded strange in his mouth. There is no help. The healers have tried everything. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a small device. It had 2 padded cups connected by a curved band. It was simple, almost primitive by galactic standards. These are called headphones, Grace said. They are very old technology for my people. But sometimes the old ways work best. She placed the headphones on the ground between them. They block out noise, she explained. When the world becomes too loud, you put these on and the sound goes away. Not completely, but enough. Enough to give your mind a chance to rest. Carveth looked at the device with suspicion. It seemed too simple, too small. How could something so fragile help with a problem so large? There is more, Grace said. I have loaded these with something we call music. It is organized sound patterns and rhythms and melodies that humans create. Some of it is loud and fast. Some of it is soft and slow. But all of it gives your emotions somewhere to go. Instead of the rage building up inside you with nowhere to escape, the music becomes a channel. A release. She stood up and brushed the dust off her clothes. I am not saying this will fix everything, she said honestly. But it might help. When the noise gets too loud, when you feel the rage coming, try these. See what happens. She turned and began to walk away. Why? Carveth called after her. Grace stopped and looked back at him. Why what? Why are you helping me? I destroyed a table in front of you. I nearly attacked you. Why do you not hate me like everyone else? Grace smiled that strange human smile. Because I do not see a monster when I look at you, Carveth. I see someone who is in pain and has never been given the right tools to cope with that pain. And because on my world, we believe that everyone deserves a chance. She continued walking, leaving Carveth alone with the headphones. He stared at them for a long time. Part of him wanted to crush them. To destroy this pathetic human device just like he destroyed everything else. It was probably useless anyway. Just another false hope that would lead to more disappointment. But another part of him, a small, tired part that was exhausted from fighting a war he could never win, wondered if maybe, just maybe, the human was right. He did not touch the headphones that night. He went back to his chambers and tried to sleep, but the sounds of the compound pressed in on him. The distant footsteps of guards, the humming of power generators, the breathing of other Zoroth in nearby rooms, every noise was a needle in his brain. The next day was no better. He had another episode during morning training and nearly killed a sparring partner. His father looked at him with that familiar mixture of disappointment and despair. The elders gathered in the corners of the room and whispered about what should be done with him. That night, Carveth sat in his chambers with his claws in his palms, drawing blood just to feel something other than rage. The headphones sat on a table nearby, still untouched. The third night was the worst. The rage came without warning, without any trigger at all. He destroyed everything in his room. He gouged the walls until his claws were bleeding. He roared until his throat was raw. And when the storm finally passed, When he was lying on the floor surrounded by destruction, he found himself reaching for the headphones. His hands were shaking as he placed them over his ears, and suddenly, the world went quiet. The silence was not complete. It was not the empty void of space or the dead quiet of a sealed chamber. But the roar of the world became a whisper. The screaming sounds that had tormented Carveth his entire life faded to a gentle hum. He lay on the floor of his destroyed room with the headphones pressed against his ears, breathing slowly for the first time in days. The relief was so overwhelming that his eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. Then the music began. Grace had preset the headphones to start playing automatically. The first sound was a single note, a piano, though Carveth did not know what a piano was. The note hung in the air, pure and clear, like a drop of water falling into a still pond. Then another note joined it. And another. They began to weave together, rising and falling in patterns that Carveth had never heard before. This was not the crash of drums or the blast of war horns that the Zorath used. This was something different, something softer, something that seemed to breathe. Carveth did not understand music. The Zorath had war chants and hunt calls, but those were tools for coordination, not expression. They had never thought to use sound for anything other than communication or intimidation. But this human music was not trying to communicate anything specific. It was not a message or a command. It was just feeling, pure feeling, translated into sound. The melody grew and swelled. There was sadness in it, but also beauty. There was pain, but also hope. It was like the music understood what it meant to suffer and was offering something in return, not a solution, but companionship, a shared experience. Carveth listened with his eyes closed and his fists slowly unclenching. The rage was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But for once, it had nowhere to go. The music was filling all the spaces where the fury usually built up. There was no room for the storm to grow. He listened to the entire playlist that night. The next day, he listened to it again. By the third day, he had memorized every note of every song. But they did not become boring. Each time he listened, he heard something new, a subtle shift in rhythm, a hidden harmony, a moment of silence that was just as important as the sounds around it. He began to understand that music was like a language, and like any language, it took time to learn. On the fourth day, Carveth left his chambers and walked to the old courtyard, where Grace had first given him the headphones. She was there, as if she had been waiting for him. She was sitting on the same fallen pillar, reading something on a small tablet. She looked up when he approached and smiled. But she did not speak. She was giving him space to start the conversation on his own terms. Carveth sat down across from her, farther than he needed to but closer than he would have allowed a week ago. The headphones hung around his neck. He had not taken them off except to sleep. "What is this?" he asked finally. His voice was rough but not with anger. "This music, why does it feel like it understands me?" Grace set down her tablet. "Because that is what music is for. Humans have always known that sometimes the only way to survive your own emotions is to give them a shape, a melody, a rhythm. Music is not just sound. It is a language for the things we cannot say." Carveth considered this. "The Zorath do not have anything like this. We have war drums, but those are just noise, controlled noise, to coordinate attacks. Every species starts somewhere," Grace said. "Humans did not always have complex music either. We started with simple rhythms, beating sticks on hollow logs. Over thousands of years, we developed instruments and techniques and styles. We learned that different types of music could create different feelings." She gestured at the headphones. "What you have been listening to is called classical music. It is very old by human standards, several hundred years. But there are many other types. Fast, aggressive music, for when you need to release energy. Slow, peaceful music for when you need to calm down. Sad music for when you need to grieve. Happy music for when you need to celebrate." Carveth's eyes widened slightly. "There is music for every feeling? There is music for every feeling that humans have ever experienced. And probably some that we have not yet found words for. Grace leaned forward. The point is not that music solves your problems. It does not. But it gives your emotions somewhere to go. Instead of building up pressure inside you until you explode, the feelings flow through you and out into the sound. This made sense to Carveth in a way that nothing else ever had. He had spent his whole life trying to suppress his fury, to push it down and contain it. But the fury was like water. The more you tried to hold it in, the more pressure it built until it broke through. Music offered a different approach. Not suppression, but expression. Not fighting the storm, but giving it a channel to flow through. "Will you teach me more?" Carveth asked. Grace's smile grew wider. "I will teach you everything I know." Over the following weeks, Carveth's education began. Grace brought him different types of music from across human history. She explained the cultural context of each style, the emotions it was designed to evoke, the techniques used to create certain effects. She taught him about rhythm, the heartbeat of music, the pulse that gave it life. She taught him about melody, the voice that sang the emotional message. She taught him about harmony, the way multiple sounds could work together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Carveth absorbed it all like a starving creature finally offered food. His mind, which had always been overwhelmed by sensory input, proved remarkably suited to analyzing and understanding complex patterns. He could hear things in the music that Grace could not, subtle variations in frequency, tiny shifts in timing, the mathematical precision underlying what seemed like pure emotion. He began to experiment with creating his own sounds. Using a simple synthesizer program that Grace loaded onto a tablet, Carveth started combining notes and rhythms in new ways. His first attempts were rough and clumsy. But there was something there. A raw energy that was uniquely his. When Grace heard his first original composition, she sat in silence for a long moment after it ended. "That was beautiful," she said finally. "And terrifying. It sounds like a storm learning to sing." Carveth did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever called anything he did beautiful, but he liked the way it felt. The other Zorath began to notice the change in him. He was still intense, still dangerous, still burning with that inner fire. But the random explosions of violence had stopped. He went to training and completed his sessions without destroying anything. He attended meals without flipping tables. He was not calm. The Zorath were never truly calm. But he was contained in a way he had never been before. His father watched him with confusion and suspicion. Drogar did not understand what had changed, and he did not trust the human who seemed to be responsible for it. But even he could not argue with results. Word spread through the Zorath compound like fire through dry grass. The war chief's son had changed. The uncontrollable cub who had injured trainers and destroyed training halls was somehow different now. He still had his fire. Anyone who looked into his amber eyes could see that the fury had not disappeared. But it moved through him differently now. It was like the difference between a wild river that flooded everything in its path and a controlled current that powered great machines. The Zorath did not understand it. They whispered about human sorcery and alien tricks. Some said the human woman had drugged him. Others said she had used some form of mind control. A few suggested that perhaps the war chief's son had simply grown up and learned discipline the way all Zorath eventually did. None of them guessed the truth. None of them knew about the music. Carveth kept his headphones hidden most of the time. He had learned that the Zorath would not understand, and he was not ready to explain. But he wore them constantly, ready to put them on at a moment's notice when he felt the rage beginning to build. More importantly, he had begun to hear music everywhere. It was strange at first, this new way of experiencing the world. The sounds that had once assaulted his mind now arranged themselves into patterns. The rhythmic footsteps of guards became a beat. The humming of power generators became a bass line. The wind through the compound corridors became a melody. The world was still loud. But now it was loud in a way that made sense. During combat training, Carveth discovered something remarkable. When he moved to the rhythm of the music in his head, his strikes became faster and more precise. His instructors could not predict his attacks because they followed patterns that no Zorath had ever used before. He was not fighting like a predator anymore, he was dancing. And his dance was deadly. His main trainer, a scarred veteran named Gorath, watched him spar one afternoon with growing amazement. Carveth moved through 5 opponents in quick succession, putting each one on the ground without seriously hurting any of them. His control was extraordinary. "What has happened to you?" Gorath demanded when the session ended. "You fight like a completely different creature." Carveth considered how to answer. He did not want to reveal his secret, but he also did not want to lie. "I found a way to give my fury direction," he said finally. "Instead of fighting against it, I let it flow through me. Like water through a channel instead of a flood over a broken dam." Gorath frowned. "That sounds like the meditation techniques. But those never worked for you. This is different. This is not about becoming empty. It is about becoming full, but full of something I can control." The old trainer did not fully understand, but he had been a warrior long enough to know that results mattered more than methods. Whatever the cub was doing, it was working. Carveth's father was more difficult to convince. Drogar had watched his son's transformation with deep suspicion. He did not trust the human. He did not trust anything that came from outside the Zorath way of doing things, and he especially did not trust a change that seemed to come from weakness rather than strength. "You spend too much time with the human," Drogar said one evening when Carveth came to report on his training progress. "People are beginning to talk. Let them talk," Carveth replied. His voice was calm, which surprised them both. A month ago, any criticism would have sent him into a rage. "My performance speaks for itself. Performance in training is not the same as performance in battle. When the blood flows and the killing begins, will your human tricks still work?" Carveth met his father's eyes steadily. "I do not know. But I know that the old way was not working. I was going to kill someone eventually. Or be killed myself. At least now I have a chance." Drogar had no response to that. Meanwhile, Carveth continued to develop his musical abilities. With Grace's encouragement, he began to experiment with combining Zorath war drums with the melodic structures he had learned from human music. The results were unlike anything either species had ever created. The sounds he made were fierce and beautiful at the same time. They had the primal power of Zorath hunt calls, but the emotional depth of human symphonies. When Grace heard his new compositions, she said they sounded like storms that had learned to think dangerous but not mindless. Powerful, but purposeful. Other young Zorath began to take notice. The first to approach Carveth was a female cub named Veska. She was small for her age and often picked on by larger cubs. She found Carveth in the old courtyard one evening, listening to his headphones with his eyes closed. "What is that device?" she asked timidly. "I have seen you wear it. It seems to bring you peace." Carveth opened his eyes and looked at her. A month ago, he would have snarled at anyone who interrupted him. Now, he simply studied her with curiosity. "It is called headphones," he said. "They play music." "Music?" Carveth considered how to explain. Then he had a better idea. He took off the headphones and held them out to her. "Listen," he said. Veska put on the headphones with trembling hands. Carveth pressed play on the tablet, selecting one of the gentler pieces that Grace had shared with him. The expression on Veska's face as she listened was something Carveth would never forget. Her eyes went wide, her mouth fell open. She stood perfectly still as the music flowed into her, and when it ended, she looked at him with wonder. "What is this?" she whispered. It is like feelings that have been given shape. It is like someone took the things inside my heart and turned them into sound." Carveth nodded. "That is exactly what it is." Veska asked if she could come back and listen again. Carveth said yes. The next day, she brought 2 friends. Within a week, there were a dozen young Zorath gathering in the courtyard each evening to experience this strange human invention called music. Grace watched this development with quiet satisfaction. She had hoped that the gift of music might help one troubled cub. She had not expected it to begin spreading through an entire generation. "You have started something," she told Carveth one evening. "Something that might change your people forever." Carveth looked at the group of young Zorath huddled around a tablet, listening to a human orchestra with expressions of wonder on their predatory faces. "I did not mean to start anything," he said. "I just wanted to stop hurting." That is often how the greatest changes begin, Grace replied. Not with grand plans, but with someone simply trying to survive their own pain and discovering something beautiful in the process. She pulled a small object from her pocket and held it out to him. It was a traditional Zorath hunt tooth, but carved with unfamiliar symbols. Your father gave this to me, she said. He said it was a token of thanks for helping his son. I want you to have it. Carveth stared at the tooth. The symbols carved into it were the marks of his family, the sigil of the war chief's bloodline. My father gave you this? He repeated, hardly believing it. He did? He does not understand what has changed in you, but he acknowledges that you are better than you were. He is grateful, even if he cannot say so directly. Carveth took the tooth with reverent hands. It was the first sign of approval his father had ever shown him, the first indication that maybe, just maybe, he was not a complete disappointment. Thank you, he said to Grace. His voice was rough with emotion. For everything. For the headphones. For the music. For not giving up on me when everyone else had, Grace smiled. Thank me by passing it on. By helping others, the way I helped you. That is how we honor the gifts we have been given, by sharing them with those who need them. Carveth nodded slowly. He understood now what he had to do. The gift of music was not meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared. The attack came without warning. The Vectari were a rival predator species from the outer reaches of the Helix cluster. They were smaller than the Zorath but faster and more numerous. For generations, the two species had competed for territory, and the old hatreds had never truly faded. When the Vectari launched a surprise raid on the Zorath border colonies, War Chief Drogar assembled a defense force immediately. Every able-bodied warrior was called to fight, including those who had not yet completed their training, including Carveth. He stood with the other young warriors as they boarded the transport ships. His headphones hung around his neck, and his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement. This was his first real battle. Everything he had learned, everything he had become, would be tested in blood and fire. Grace found him just before departure. Her face was pale with worry, but she tried to hide it behind a brave smile. Be careful, she said. Remember everything we talked about. The music is inside you now. You do not need the headphones to access it. Carveth nodded. He wanted to say something meaningful, something to express how much she had changed his life. But there was no time. The boarding call sounded, and he had to go. I will come back, he promised. And when I do, I will have stories to tell you. Grace watched him board the ship. She did not know if she would ever see him again. The journey to the border colonies took 3 days. Carveth spent most of that time in quiet meditation, replaying music in his mind, and preparing himself for what was to come. The other young warriors were tense and jumpy, their predator instincts screaming for action. But Carveth remained calm. He had learned that true strength came not from the intensity of his fury but from his ability to direct it. When they arrived, the battle was already raging. The Vectari had overrun 2 of the outer settlements and were pushing toward the main colony hub. The Zorath defenders were holding the line, but barely. Bodies from both species littered the ground, and the air was thick with the smells of blood and burning. Carveth's unit was deployed to reinforce a crumbling defensive position. As he took his place on the line, he felt the old fury rising in his chest. The sounds of battle crashed against his senses like waves against a cliff, screams and explosions and the clash of claws and weapons. The chaos was exactly the kind of environment that had always triggered his worst episodes. He reached for his headphones, but a Vectari warrior was already charging at him. There was no time. He had to fight. The next few minutes were a blur of violence. Carveth moved on pure instinct, his claws finding targets almost before his conscious mind could register them. He felt the rage trying to take control, trying to turn him into the mindless beast he had always feared becoming. And then he remembered what Grace had told him. The music is inside you now. In the chaos of battle, with death all around him, Carveth began to sing. It was a war hymn he had composed himself over the past months, a thundering melody that merged the ancient Zorath hunt calls with the structured beauty of human music. His voice was rough and untrained, but it cut through the noise of combat like a blade through flesh. The Zoroath warriors near him faltered for a moment, confused. They had never heard anything like this. But something about the rhythm resonated with their predator instincts. The song gave shape to their fury, direction to their violence. One by one, other Zoroath began to join in. They did not know the words or the melody, but they found themselves humming along, growling in rhythm, adding their voices to the rising tide of sound. The war hymn spread through the defensive line like a living thing, passed from warrior to warrior until the entire position was singing. The Vektari hesitated. They had fought the Zoroath many times before. They knew what to expect from their ancient enemies, rage and savagery, and individual combat prowess. But this was different. This was organized. This was unified. The Zoroath were not just fighting anymore. They were moving as one. Their strikes falling in rhythm. Their fury channeled into a single devastating symphony. Where before they had been individual predators, now they were a chorus of destruction that operated with a single mind. Carveth felt the music flowing through him and into his brothers and sisters in battle. He was the conductor, and they were his orchestra. Every note of his war hymn translated into action, guiding the Zoroath to attack where the Vektari were weak and defend where they were strong. The tide of battle turned. Within an hour, the Vektari were in full retreat. Within 3 hours, they had fled the system entirely. The border colonies were saved. Carveth stood in the aftermath, surrounded by the bodies of fallen enemies, and realized that something fundamental had changed. Not just in himself, but in his people. The other warriors were looking at him with expressions he had never seen before. Not fear, not suspicion, but something like awe. They had felt the power of the music. They had experienced what it meant to fight not as individuals but as a unified force. His father approached him through the carnage. Drogar's armor was dented and splashed with blood, but he was alive and victorious. He stopped in front of his son and studied him for a long moment. "What was that?" the war chief asked finally. "That sound you were making. That song." Carveth met his father's eyes. "It is called music. The human taught me." He expected anger. He expected dismissal or ridicule. But Drogar just nodded slowly. "It worked," the war chief said. "Whatever it was, it worked. You turned a defensive line into a unified assault force. I have never seen anything like it. It can be taught," Carveth said. "What I did today, others can learn to do it too. It does not just help those like me, the ones who cannot control their fury. It helps everyone. It gives the rage direction, purpose." Drogar was silent for a long time. Then he placed his massive hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of approval that Carveth had waited his entire life to receive. "Then teach them," the war chief said. "Teach all of our warriors. If this music can give us such an advantage in battle, it must become part of our training." Carveth nodded. He had come to this battle as a troubled cub with something to prove. He was leaving as something else. A teacher. A leader. And the beginning of a revolution in Zoroath culture. When he returned home, Grace was waiting for him. She ran to meet him when he stepped off the transport ship, and for a moment, she forgot herself and threw her arms around him in a human hug. Carveth stood awkwardly in her embrace, unsure how to respond. Physical affection was not part of Zoroath culture, but he found that he did not mind. "You came back," she said, her voice thick with relief. "I was so worried." "I came back," he agreed. "And I have stories to tell you." The music worked, Grace. Not just for me, for all of them. I sang in the middle of battle, and the other warriors joined in, and together we became something greater than we were apart. Grace pulled back and looked up at him. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. "I knew it would," she said. "I knew you had it in you. Not just the music, but the ability to share it, to lead, to show others what you had learned." In the years that followed, the Zoroath were transformed. Music became a central part of their culture, not replacing their warrior traditions but enhancing them. War hymns were developed for every type of combat. Training included rhythmic drills set to melody. Young Zorath learned to express their emotions through song before they learned to fight. And in the Hall of Heroes, beside ancient weapons and trophies of conquest, a place of honor was given to a simple pair of human headphones. They were small and fragile, utterly unremarkable by galactic standards, but they had changed everything. Grace eventually returned to Earth, but she stayed in contact with Carveth for the rest of her life. He sent her recordings of new compositions, fierce and beautiful, and unlike anything humans had ever created. She sent him playlists from across human history, introducing him to jazz and rock and blues and all the messy, wonderful sounds of a species that had learned to turn pain into art. In her final years, when Grace was old and gray and her fingers were too stiff to type easily, she received one last message from Carveth. He was an elder now, respected throughout the galaxy as the father of Zorath music. His war hymns were studied by military academies across the Coalition. His compositions were performed on 100 worlds. But his message to Grace was simple. "You taught me that fury is not a curse," he wrote. "It is a fire. And fires, when given the right shape, do not destroy. They illuminate. Thank you for showing me how to burn without being consumed. Thank you for the gift of music. Thank you for seeing something in a broken cub that no one else could see. I will carry your kindness with me until my last breath, and I will pass it on to every generation that comes after." Grace read the message through her tears, and she smiled. This was what humans did. They reached across the void of space and the differences between species, and they shared the best parts of themselves. Not because they expected anything in return, but because they knew that the universe was a little less dark when you helped someone find their song. And somewhere in the Helix cluster, a species of apex predators had learned to sing. The end.